Ann from House Quilts, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about quilting, the actual attaching of the 3 layers together to make a quilt. Every quilt has a back, and when you go to layer them together, you have the right side facing down. Then you take a batting and put a batting on top of the back, and the batting should be about the same size as the back. And then you take your finished quilt top and layer that on, and this needs to be smaller than the batting in the back because it can pull up a bit as it quilts, and you never want to run out of back or batting. So that's the basic idea. This is called a sandwich, and what we're going to do with the quilt stitch is actually attach all 3 layers together. And every time a quilt gets quilted, there is some magical moment when all these separate pieces all of a sudden feel like one unit. And it's just really cool when all of a sudden it's one. It's great. So I have here an old quilt based on the fabrics. It's mostly, I think, 1930s fabrics. It's hand quilted, and you can see some of the quilting stitches here. I think it's really interesting to look at the quilting on this quilt and see how the quilt maker followed the lines. It's all done by hand, went in the ditch along each of the piecing, and then all around the edge of the star just made a grid. And the grid pretty much goes to the tips in the design. So quilting changed. A lot of it depended on the time of year you were making a quilt. If you had a summer quilt, you may not put batting in. And then it also depended on the kind of the batting you used. And the older batting used to separate, so you had to quilt close together so that you would hold the batting together more. And it was this big revelation when they learned how to bond bat, and all of a sudden the bat wasn't going to separate, wasn't going to lump, so it was like this big freedom. You could do whatever you want, so you could quilt as much as 5-6 inches apart and everything was going to stay together. So this was a big thing. And then at some point, people started quilting on their home sewing machines, and they stopped doing all the hand quilting work. And it's like, oh, is this a real quilt or not? A real quilt has to be hand quilted. And then after a while, machine quilting on your home machine became very acceptable, and that was real quilting. And then long armors came out. Well, that wasn't done by hand on your machine, so that wasn't real quilting at first. And then obviously everything got accepted. So today we have hand quilting, we have home on your machine, and we have long arming. They're all totally accepted, they are all beautiful. And I have some samples of several of those here today. So back to hand quilting. This is from the 80s, and you can see it's a log cabin block, but you can see the hand stitching there. And on the other side, it's just all in the ditch, so it doesn't show up that much. But this is a little puffier batting, and there's a little bit of puff that happens between each of the logs. This one was an example of the freedom of the bonded bat. So this whole big square would normally have been quilted, but it could be left open because the batting wasn't going to go anywhere, and it would stay together. This is another example of being able to be far apart. You can see these big distances here. And this is a case of not marking the line, but just kind of eyeballing, going right diagonally through everything. So it's a case of it sticks together, do minimal, enough to give a design, but the quilting isn't the main part of that particular quilt. This is an example of like a sew and flip. You start in the middle, and you put your 2 sides, you lay them right sides together, sew it, and then flip it out, and then do these 2 sides, flip it out, and it's sew, flip, and you can see the diagonal line, whoops, threads. See the diagonal line going all the way along, and then just put some binding on, and it's done. It's also called Quilt As You Go, which is liked by a lot of people, and it's really fun when you can do it. This one shows some parallel stitching. We have in the zigzag around the edges, I have an echo quilting where I've gone kind of the same distance apart, and it makes this nice design around the edges. And it doesn't show up real well, but everywhere the brown print is, it's stippled, which is just kind of a meander stitch. You go around and round and round and round and round. And the trick with stippling is you have to tell yourself to be patient. You've dropped your feed dog, so if you go too fast, it's easy to get irregular stitches or get some real long ones that can snag on things. So you have to just go patiently and calmly, and you kind of get in the rhythm and you get in the flow. And actually, with stippling, you get in the flow, you can even write your name after a while, because that's one of the best embedded memories that your brain has, and it just knows how to flow and go and write your name. So this is an example of stippling and the echo quilting. This one, it's just real easy. Lots of times I don't like to take the time to mark for quilting. So this is just totally in the diagonal. It's about every third row, because these rows are small, little, and it's just enough to hold it together and give a nice little bit of puff for the trip around the world. And you can kind of see it on the back, kind of. I like backs with lots of print on, because they do tend to hide the stitches. So if you mess up a little bit, it's not very noticeable. So anyway, this is Trip Around the World with just some nice echo quilting there too. This one shows you again the multiple lines together, and what I did was in the border they're about 1/4 inch apart, and then here they're more like a 3/4 to 1 inch. So it's the same idea where you repeat parallel lines, but they are different proportions. And in the very middle here I did a little flower. It's just for fun. I could have come right through. I didn't do right there. I could have gone right that way and done an X through the middle, but I chose to have a little flower first. And then the points, I thought that was a fun touch to come up there. And I've got a little star in each corner. So these are some examples of quilting you can do on your home sewing machine. Stay tuned. We have some other examples to show you on the long arm. Happy quilting from House Quilts.